Chapter 2, Part 2. The landing at W Beach under Cape Teki. The men told off for this landing were the 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers, supported later by the Worcester Regiment. The men were landed at 6 a.m. from ship's boats run ashore by picket boats. On landing, they rushed the wire entanglements, broke through them with heavy loss, and won to the dead ground under the cliffs. The ships drew nearer to the beach and opened heavy fire upon the Turks, and the landing party stormed the cliffs and won the trenches. The Worcester Regiment, having landed, attempts were made to break away to the right, so as to join hands with the men on V Beach. All the land between the two beaches was heavily wired and so broken that it gave much cover to the enemy. Many brave Worcesters went out to cut the wires and were killed. The fire was intense. There was no getting further. The trenches already won were secured and improved. The few available reserves were hurried up, and by dark, when the Turks attacked, again and again, in great force, our men were able to beat them off and hold on to what they had won. The landing at X Beach, sometimes called Implacable Landing, towards Krithia. The men told off for this landing were the 1st Royal Fusiliers, with a working party of the Anson Battalion, R.N.D. These men were towed ashore from HMS Implacable about an hour after dawn. The ship stood close in to the beach and opened rapid fire on the enemy trenches. Under cover of this fire, the men got ashore fairly easily. On moving inland, they were attacked by a great force of Turks and checked, but they made good the ground won and opened up communications with the Lancashires who had landed at W Beach. This landing was the least bloody of all. Of the two flank landings, that on the right, within the straits, to the right of Sed El Bar, got ashore without great loss and held on. That on the left, to the left of X Beach, got ashore, fought a desperate and bloody battle against 5 times its strength, and finally had to re-embark. The men got ashore upon a cliff so steep that the Turks had not troubled to defend it, but on landing they were unable to link up with the men on X Beach as had been planned. They were attacked in great force by an ever-growing Turkish army, fought all day and all through the night in such trenches as they had been able to dig under fire, and at last, in the morning of the next day, went down the cliffs and re-embarked, most nobly covered to the end by a party from the King's Own Scottish Borderers and the Plymouth Battalion. During the forenoon of the 25th, a regiment of the French Corps landed at Cum Cale under cover of the guns of the French warships and engaged the enemy throughout the day and night. Their progress was held up by a strongly entrenched force during the afternoon, and after sharp fighting all through the night, they re-embarked in the forenoon of the 26th with some 400 Turkish prisoners. This landing of the French diverted from us on the 25th the fire of the howitzers emplaced on the Asiatic shore. Had these been free to fire upon us, the landings near Sed El Bar would have been made even more hazardous than they were. At Bulair, one man, Lieutenant Freiberg, swam ashore from a destroyer, towing a little raft of flares. Near the shore, he lit 2 of these flares. Then, wading onto the land, he lit others at intervals along the coast. Then he wandered inland, naked, on a personal reconnaissance, and soon found a large Turkish army strongly entrenched. Modesty forbade further intrusion. He went back to the beach and swam off to his destroyer, could not find her in the dark, and swam for several miles, was exhausted and cramped, and was at last picked up, nearly dead. This magnificent act of courage and endurance, done by one unarmed man, kept a large Turkish army at Bulair during the critical hours of the landing. The Constantinople papers were filled with accounts of the repulse of the great attack at Bulair. The flares deceived the Turks even more completely than had been hoped. While these operations were securing our hold upon the extreme end of the peninsula, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps were making good their landing on the Aegean coast to the north of Gaba Tepe. They sailed from Mudros on the 24th, arrived off the coast of the peninsula at about 1:30 on the morning of the 25th, and there, under a setting moon, in calm weather, they went on board the boats which were to take them ashore. At about 3:30, the tows left the ships and proceeded in darkness to the coast. Gaba or Kaba Tepe is a steep cliff or promontory about 70 feet high with a whitish nose and something the look of a blunt-nosed torpedo or porpoise. It is a forbidding-looking snout of land, covered with scrub where it is not too steep for roots to hold, and washed by deep water. About a mile to the north of it there is a possible landing place, and north of that again a long and narrow strip of beach between two little headlands. This latter beach cannot be seen from Gaba Tepe. The ground above these beach is exceedingly steep sandy cliff, broken by two great gullies or ravines which run inland. All the ground, except in one patch in the southern ravine, where there is a sort of meadow of grass, is densely covered with scrub, mostly between 2 and 3 feet high. Inland from the beach, the land of the peninsula rises in steep, broken hills and spurs, with clumps of pine upon them and dense undergrowths of scrub. The men selected for this landing were the 3rd Brigade of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, followed and supported by the 1st and 2nd Brigades. The place selected for the landing was the southern beach and nearer of the two to Gaba Tepe. This, like the other landing places near Cape Helles, was strongly defended and most difficult of approach. Large forces of Turks were entrenched there, well prepared, but in the darkness of the early morning, after the moon had set, the tows stood a little further to the north than they should have done, perhaps because some high ground to their left made a convenient steering mark against the stars. They headed in towards the northern beach between the two little headlands, where the Turks were not expecting them. However, they were soon seen, and very heavy independent rifle fire was concentrated on them. As they neared the beach, about 1 battalion of Turks doubled along the land to intercept them. These men came from nearer Gaba Tepe, firing as they ran into the mass of the boats at short range. A great many men were killed in the boats, but the dead men's oars were taken by survivors, and the boats forced into the shingle. The men jumped out, waded ashore, charged the enemy with a bayonet, and broke the Turk attack to pieces. The Turks scattered and were pursued, and now the steep, scrub-covered cliffs became the scene of the most desperate fighting. The scattered Turks dropped into the scrub and disappeared. Hidden all over the rough cliffs, under every kind of cover, they sniped the beach or ambushed the little parties of the 3rd Brigade who had rushed the landing. All over the broken hills there were isolated fights to the death, men falling into gullies and being bayoneted, sudden duels, point blank, where men crawling through the scrub met each other and life went to the quicker finger, heroic deaths where some half-section which had lost touch were caught by 10 times their strength and charged and died. No man of our side knew that cracked and fissured jungle. Men broke through it onto machine guns, or showed up on a crest and were blown to pieces, or leaped down from it into some sap or trench to catch the bombs flung at them and hurl them at the thrower. Going as they did, up cliffs, through scrub, over ground which would have broken the alignment of the 10th Legion, they passed many hidden Turks, who were thus left to shoot them in the back or to fire down at the boats from perhaps only 50 yards away. It was only just light. Theirs was the first British survey of that wild country. Only now, as it showed up clear, could they realize its difficulty. They pressed on up the hill. They dropped and fired and died. They drove the Turks back. They flung their packs away, wormed through the bush, and stalked the snipers from the flash. As they went, the words of their song supported them, the ribald and proud chorus of "Australia will be there," which the men on the torpedoed Southland sang as they fell in, expecting death. Presently, as it grew lighter, the Turks' big howitzers began shelling the beach, and their field guns, well hidden, opened on the transports now busy disembarking the 1st and 2nd Brigades. They forced the transports to stand further out to sea and shelled the tows as they came in with shrapnel and high explosive. As the boats drew near the shore, every gun on Gaba Tepe took them in flank, and the snipers concentrated on them from the shore. More and more Turks were coming up at the double to stop the attack up the hill. The fighting in the scrub grew fiercer. Shells burst continually upon the beach. Boats were sunk. Men were killed in the water. The boatmen and beach-working parties were the unsung heroes of that landing. The boatmen came in with the tows, under fire, waited with them under intense and concentrated fire of every kind until they were unloaded, and then shoved off and put slowly back for more, and then came back again. The beach parties were waiting to and from that shell-smitten beach all day, unloading, carrying ashore, and sorting the munitions and necessaries for many thousands of men. They worked in a strip of beach and sea from 500 yards long by 40 broad, and the fire directed on that strip was such that every box brought ashore had one or more shells and not less than 50 bullets directed at it before it was flung upon the sand. More men came in and went on up the hill in support, but as yet there were no guns ashore, and the Turks' fire became intenser. By 10 o'clock, the Turks had had time to bring up enough men from their prepared positions to hold up the advance. Scattered parties of our men who had gone too far in the scrub were cut off and killed, for there was no thought of surrender in those marvelous young men. They were the flower of this world's manhood, and died as they had lived, owning no master on this earth. More and more Turks came up with big and field artillery, and now our attack had to hold on to what it had won, against more than twice its numbers. We had won a rough bow of ground, in which the beach represented the bowstring, the beach near Gaba Tepe, the south end, and the hovel known as Fisherman's Hut, the north. Against this position, held by at most 8,000 of our men, who had had no rest and had fought hard since dawn, under every kind of fire in a savage, rough country unknown to them, came an overwhelming army of Turks to drive them into the sea. For 4 hours the Turks attacked and again attacked, with a terrific fire of artillery and waves of men in succession. They came fresh from superior positions with many guns to break a disorganized line of breathless men not yet dug in. The guns of the ships opened on them, and the scattered units in the scrub rolled them back again and again by rifle and machine gun fire, and by charge after countercharge. More of the Army Corps landed to meet the Turks. The fire upon the beach never slackened, and they came ashore across corpses and wrecked boats and a path like a road in hell, with ruin and blasts and burning. They went up the cliff to their fellows under an ever-growing fire that lit the scrub and burned the wounded and the dead. Darkness came, but there was no rest nor lull. Wave after wave of Turks came out of the night, crying the proclamation of their fate. Others stole up in the dark through the scrub and shot or stabbed and crept back, or were seen and stalked and killed. Flares went up to light with their blue and ghastly glare the wild glens peopled by the enemy. Men worked at the digging in till they dropped asleep upon the soil, and more Turks charged, and they woke and fired and again dug. It was cruelly cold after the sun had gone, but there was no chance of warmth or proper food. To dig in and beat back the Turk or die was all that men could think of. In the darkness, among the blasts of the shells, men scrambled up and down the pathless cliffs, bringing up tins of water and boxes of cartridges, hauling up guns and shells, and bringing down the wounded. The beach was heaped with wounded, placed as close under the cliff as might be, in such yard or so of dead ground as the cliffs gave. The doctors worked among them, and shells fell among them, and doctors and wounded were blown to pieces, and the survivors sang their song of "Australia will be there," and cheered the newcomers still landing on the beach. Sometimes our fire seemed to cease, and then the Turk shells filled the night with their scream and blast and the pattering of their fragments, with all the fury and the crying of the shells, and the shouts and cries and cursing on the beach, the rattle of the small arms and the cheers and defiance up the hill, and the roar of the great guns far away at sea or in the olive groves. The night seemed in travail of a new age. All the blackness was shot with little spurts of fire, and streaks of fire, and malignant bursts of fire, and arcs and glows and crawling snakes of fire, and the moon rose and looked down upon it all. In the fiercer hours of that night, shells fell in that contested mile of ground, and on the beach beyond it, at the rate of one a second, and the air whimpered with passing bullets, or fluttered with the rush of the big shells, or struck the head of the passer like a moving wall with the shock of the explosion. All through the night the Turks attacked, and in the early hours their fire of shrapnel became so hellish that the Australians soon had not men enough left to hold the line. Orders were given to fall back to a shorter line, but in the darkness, uproar, and confusion, with many sections refusing to fall back, others falling back and losing touch, others losing their way in gully or precipice, and shrapnel hailing on all, as it had hailed for hours, the falling back was mistaken by some for an order to re-embark. Many men who had lost their officers and non-commissioned officers fell back to the beach, where the confusion of wounded men, boxes of stores, field dressing stations, corpses, and the litter and the waste of battle had already blocked the going. The shells bursting in this clutter made the beach, in the words of an eyewitness, like bloody hell and nothing else. But at this breaking of the wave of victory, this panting moment in the race, when some of the runners had lost their first wind, encouragement reached our men. A message came to the beach from Sir Ian Hamilton to say that help was coming, and that an Australian submarine had entered the Narrows and had sunk a Turkish transport off Chanak. This word of victory, coming to men who thought for the moment that their efforts had been made in vain, had the effect of a fresh brigade. The men rallied back up the hill, bearing the news to the firing line. The new constricted line was made good, and the rest of the night was never anything but continued victory to those weary ones in the scrub. But 24 hours of continual battle exhausts men, and by dawn the Turks, knowing the weariness of our men, resolved to beat them down into the sea. When the sun was well in our men's eyes, they attacked again, with not less than twice our entire strength of fresh men, and with an overwhelming superiority in field artillery. Something in the Turk commander and the knowledge that a success there would bring our men across the peninsula within a day made the Turks more desperate enemies there than elsewhere. They came at us with a determination which might have triumphed against other troops. As they came on, they opened a terrific fire of shrapnel upon our position, pouring in such a hail that months afterwards one could see their round shrapnel bullets stuck in bare patches of ground, or in earth thrown up from the trenches as thickly as plums in a pudding. Their multitudes of men pressed through the scrub as skirmishers and sniped at every moving thing, for they were on higher ground and could see over most of our position, and every man we had was under direct fire for hours of each day. As the attack developed, the promised help arrived. Our warships stood in and opened on the Turks with every gun that would bear. Some kept down the guns of Gallipoli, others searched the line of the Turk advance till the hills over which they came were swathed with yellow smoke and dust, the white clouds of shrapnel, and the drifting darkness of conflagration. All the scrub was in a blaze before them, but they pressed on, falling in heaps and lines, and their guns dropped a never-ceasing rain of shells on trenches, beach, and shipping. The landing of stores and ammunition never ceased during the battle. The work of the beach parties in that scene of burning and massacre was beyond all praise. So was the work of the fatigue parties who passed up and down the hill with water, ammunition, and food, or dug sheltered roads to the trenches. So was the work of the medical service, who got the wounded out of cuts in the earth so narrow and so twisted that there was no using a stretcher, and men had to be carried on stretcher-bearers' backs or on improvised chairs made out of packing cases. At a little before noon, the Turk attack reached its height in a blaze and uproar of fire, and the swaying forward of their multitudes. The guns of the warships swept them from flank to flank with every engine of death. They died by hundreds, and the attack withered as it came. Our men saw the enemy fade and slacken and halt. Then, with their cheer, they charged him and beat him home, seized new ground from him, and dug themselves in front of him. All through the day there was fighting up and down the line, partial attacks, and never-ceasing shell fire, but no other great attack. The Turks had suffered too much. At night, their snipers came out in the scrub and shot at anything they could see, and all night long their men dragged up field guns and piles of shrapnel and worked at the trenches which were to contain ours. When day dawned, they opened with shrapnel upon the beach, with a feu de barrage designed to stop all landing of men and stores. They whipped the bay with shrapnel bullets. Where their fire was concentrated, the water was lashed as with hail all day long. But the boats passed through it, and men worked in it, building jetties for the boats to land at, using a big Turk shell as a pile driver. When they got too hot, they bathed in it, for no fire shook those men. It was said that when a big shell was coming, men of other races would go into their dugouts, but that these men paused only to call it a bastard and then went on with their work. By the night of the second day, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps had won and fortified their position. Men writing or reporting on service about them referred to them as the ANZAC, and these letters soon came to mean the place in which they were, unnamed till then, probably, save by some rough Turkish place name, but now likely to be printed on all English maps with the other names of Brighton Beach and Hell Spit, which mark a great passage of arms. End of section 4.